He was supposed to save the galaxy. He burned it down instead. And then in the last moment, anyone would have predicted, against every odd the universe had stacked against it, he saved it anyway. That is the story of Anakin Skywalker in 3 sentences. But 3 sentences cannot hold what this life actually was. They cannot hold a slave boy racing a pod across a desert at 300 miles an hour, trusting something he didn't have a name for yet. They cannot hold the moment a dying man used his last breath to ask a favor that would echo across decades. They cannot hold a secret wedding, a war that changed everything, a vision of his own future, so terrible he couldn't speak it aloud, a choice made in 1 second that cost the galaxy a generation. And they cannot hold a son standing in front of his father, refusing to believe that a man in a black suit was all that was left. This is the entire story, start to finish, every piece of it. The question at the center of it, the one people have been arguing about since the Emperor fell, is not whether Anakin Skywalker was good or evil. He was both. The question is how. How does the person the ancient prophecy called the Chosen One, the boy who built a droid to keep his mother company, the general who knew every one of his soldiers by name, how does that person march into the Jedi Temple with a lightsaber and not stop? And how does that same person, 23 years later, lift the Emperor over his head and throw him into the dark? The answer is one life, a full one, longer and stranger and more painful than the legend captures. It begins, as the most important things tend to, with a woman and a desert. The Jedi Order had carried a prophecy for centuries, like a splinter buried under skin, something they knew was there but couldn't quite locate, couldn't quite remove. It spoke of one who would be born of no father, one in whom the Force would run so deep that the numbers measuring it would break every scale ever designed, one who would rise from nothing and shatter a darkness that had been building in secret for 1,000 years. They called this person the Chosen One. They debated endlessly about what the prophecy meant, and they never fully agreed. And the disagreement turned out to matter less than they thought, because the Force, when it was ready, did not ask the Jedi Council for its interpretation. It simply acted. Tatooine is a planet that was never meant to sustain civilization. 2 suns bake it daily into something like the inside of an oven. Water is precious and rare. The wind carries sand into everything, into your food, into your lungs, into the creases of your hands. There is nothing gentle about it, nothing soft. It is a world that asks every person who lives on it a simple and brutal question: how much can you take? And it asks that question every single day. Shmi Skywalker lived on Tatooine as a slave. She had been sold as a child and had known no other life. She worked for a junk dealer named Watto, a squat and greedy Toydarian who ran a shop in the settlement of Mos Espa, trading in parts salvaged from crashed ships and broken machines scattered across the desert. Watto was not a cruel master by the standards of Tatooine's slave economy. He did not beat his slaves, did not torture them, but he was indifferent to their personhood in the way that ownership demands indifference. And that indifference was its own kind of cruelty. Shmi and her son Anakin lived in a small dwelling in the slave quarter of Mos Espa, a cluster of low buildings baked hard by decades of sun. By the standards of the Outer Rim, their life was modest but not desperate. By any standard worth applying to a human being, they were trapped. Shmi was remarkable in ways that are easy to overlook. She had been dealt circumstances that would have broken most people, and she chose every single morning not to be broken. She chose warmth. She chose kindness. She chose to raise her son with a quality that is perhaps the rarest thing on any planet in any galaxy: genuine, uncomplicated love. She did not make him promises she could not keep. She did not pretend their situation was something other than what it was. But she loved him with a completeness that shaped the core of who he became, and that shaping was both his greatest strength and, in the end, one of the fault lines that ran through him. Anakin Skywalker came into the world without a father. Shmi could not explain it. There was simply no father. He was there one morning inside her, and 9 months later he was born. And the Force, if it could be said to speak, had spoken something enormous into the world. He grew fast and curious and talented in ways that seemed almost unfair. By the time he was 7 years old, he could fix machines that experienced mechanics couldn't diagnose. He understood the inner workings of equipment, the way a musician understands a song, not through analysis, but through something more instinctive, more intimate, as if the machines were simply telling him what they needed. He built things from scraps. He modified things. He improved things. He saw possibility in the broken and discarded, which was, perhaps, the only kind of education Tatooine could offer. He had begun building a protocol droid from parts salvaged out of Watto's junk heaps. He worked on it in the evenings after his duties were done, piece by piece, circuit by circuit, and slowly the thing came together. He wanted his mother to have someone to talk to when he was away. He wanted her to have a companion, that impulse to protect the people he loved, to ease their suffering, to use whatever gifts he had in service of the people who mattered to him, was the purest thing about Anakin Skywalker. It was there from the beginning. It would never fully leave him, even in the darkest chapters of his life. And it would be, in the end, both his greatest virtue and the very lever that his enemies used to undo him. He also raced pods. This requires a moment of explanation, because pod racing is not something a 9-year-old human being should be able to do. A pod racer is essentially a pair of enormous turbine engines connected by thin cables to a small cockpit, and it moves at speeds that turn the surrounding desert into a blur of ochre and noise. The G-forces alone are enough to incapacitate most adult pilots. The reflexes required to navigate the course filled with narrow canyon walls, sharp turns. Competing racers who play dirty are beyond what any unaugmented human nervous system can reliably manage. Humans don't race pods. They don't survive it long enough to get good at it. Anakin not only survived it, he was extraordinary at it. He had never won the Boonta Eve Classic, the most prestigious race on Tatooine. But he had come close more than once, and his times were remarkable for someone of any species, let alone a child of 9. The reason was simple enough, even if the implications were staggering. His force sensitivity gave him reflexes that operated faster than conscious thought. He didn't react to obstacles. He anticipated them. The Force moved in him like a second nervous system, faster and older than anything biological. And in the cockpit of a pod racer, that gift translated into something that looked, to observers, like impossible talent. He didn't know it was the Force. He knew it as a feeling, a certainty that arrived before the information that should have caused it. A sense of rightness when his hands moved the controls in directions that shouldn't have been the right directions until they suddenly were. He dreamed of leaving Tatooine. Of course he did. Every child who has ever been trapped somewhere has dreamed of leaving, and Anakin was no exception. But his dream had a specific quality that separated it from ordinary childhood fantasy. He did not merely dream of escape. He dreamed of becoming something, of going out into the galaxy and being useful, being powerful enough that no one he loved would ever suffer again. He dreamed of freeing his mother. He dreamed of seeing the stars up close instead of just at night from a desert rooftop. He was 9 years old, and he carried the weight of those dreams with a seriousness that most adults never manage. He also carried something else, a loneliness so deep it had become structural, a part of the architecture of who he was. The Force set him apart from other children, even when he didn't understand why. He felt things they didn't feel. He knew things before they happened in ways he couldn't explain. He was different, and children in the slave quarters of Mos Espa were not kind to different. He had friends, in the loose way that children in difficult circumstances create bonds. But no one who truly understood him. Shmi understood him, and that was everything. And it was also not quite enough, because a mother's love, however complete, cannot fill every space a person needs filled. In 32 BBY, the galaxy shifted in a way that looked, from a distance, like a small political dispute. The Trade Federation, manipulated by a shadowed figure calling himself Darth Sidious, placed a blockade around the peaceful planet of Naboo, ostensibly over taxation disputes, but in reality, as the opening move of a plan that had been decades in the making. 2 Jedi were dispatched to resolve the matter. Their ship was damaged in the confrontation, and they were forced to land somewhere the Trade Federation had no authority, somewhere controlled by the Hutt, where Republic law meant nothing, and where a junk dealer named Watto operated a shop in a dusty settlement called Mos Espa. Qui-Gon Jinn was not a typical Jedi Master. He had been trained by one of the greatest Jedi of the previous generation, and then had diverged from the path that Master had walked in ways that created friction with the Council for the rest of his life. He followed the living force, the immediate, present, breathing reality of the Force, as it moved through living things rather than the unifying force's concern with grand patterns and prophecies. And yet he knew the ancient texts. He had read the prophecy of the Chosen One, and unlike most of his colleagues who dismissed it as mystical nonsense, he believed it. He had held that belief quietly for years. The way a person holds an expectation they don't want to jinx. He walked into Watto's shop looking for a hyperdrive generator. He walked out having found something he had not known he was looking for at all. The boy was there when the sandstorm came. He invited the strangers in without hesitation. Qui-Gon, the disguised queen of Naboo, who had come to see the world for herself, and a Gungan exile named Jar Jar Binks, who had attached himself to the group with cheerful tenacity. Anakin brought them home to the slave quarter without any calculation, without any thought, beyond the simple fact that they needed shelter, and he could provide it. That generosity was immediate and unconditional, and Qui-Gon noticed it. He noticed everything about the boy. That evening, in the warmth of the small dwelling, Qui-Gon watched Anakin closely. He listened to the boy talk about his dreams, about the future he imagined for himself, about the stars and the ships and the freedom he intended to find someday. And he felt, beneath the words, the Force moving through this child with an intensity he had never encountered before. not even from the greatest masters he had known, not even from Yoda. It was something different, deeper, raw, more elemental, as if the Force itself was closer to the surface in this boy than in any being Qui-Gon had ever met. He found a pretext to take a blood sample. He sent the results to his Padawan on the ship. When the numbers came back, they sat in silence for a moment before Qui-Gon replied. Over 20,000 midi-chlorians per cell. Higher than Master Yoda. Higher than any Jedi ever recorded. The number was not merely impressive. It was impossible by any scale the Order had established. And Shmi had said, there was no father. Think about what Qui-Gon felt in that moment. He had carried the prophecy of the Chosen One in his heart for years, a belief others had politely ignored, a conviction he had never had cause to test against reality. And now here, in a slave's dwelling on the most forgotten planet in the galaxy, a child was sitting cross-legged on the floor, telling him about wanting to be a pilot, and the Force was singing around him like a current around a stone. Qui-Gon wanted to take Anakin with him immediately. But Anakin was not free to be taken anywhere. He was a slave. He belonged to Watto, legally and absolutely. And Watto was not going to simply give away a child who was his best mechanic and a pod racer of extraordinary talent. Qui-Gon had very little to offer. He had no Republic credits Watto would accept. He had no leverage. And he had a failing hyperdrive and a Queen of Naboo who needed to reach Coruscant before a planetary occupation became a massacre. So he made a wager. He arranged to enter Anakin in the upcoming Boonta Eve Classic. If Anakin won, Watto would hand over the parts needed to repair the ship, and Anakin would go free. If Anakin lost, Watto would keep their ship as well. It was a gamble that hinged entirely on the abilities of a 9-year-old slave boy in the most dangerous race in the Outer Rim. And Qui-Gon placed it with the calm certainty of a man who was not gambling at all, who was simply watching the Force arrange the pieces it had been moving for years. The night before the race, Qui-Gon did something quiet and important. He knelt beside Anakin as the boy was preparing for bed. And he talked to him not about the Force, not about prophecies or destiny, or the weight of anything, but about the race, about staying calm, about trusting what he felt. He told Anakin to feel, not to think. He placed his hands on the boy's shoulders and looked at him directly. And Anakin, who had spent years being someone's property, being a tool with a name, felt in that gaze something he was not used to, being seen, not for what he could do, not for his usefulness, but for what he was. The Boonta Eve Classic was everything that pod racing is supposed to be: brutal and loud and dazzling and unfair. Sebulba, the reigning champion, cheated with the practiced ease of someone who had never once needed to answer for it. He damaged other racers, drove them into the walls, cut them off at angles that should have been illegal and were technically illegal, but nobody on Tatooine was going to call him on it. Anakin started near the back of the field. He fell further behind when his racer took damage early. And then something happened that was difficult to explain in terms that left the Force out of it. He caught up. He came back through the field lap by lap, his reflexes doing things that shouldn't have been physically possible, his hands finding angles and lines through the course that no one watching from the stands could have anticipated. There was a moment in one of the narrow canyon passages when Sebulba clipped Anakin's pod and the two machines were briefly locked together at 300 miles per hour, grinding against each other with a sound like the end of something. And Anakin did not flinch. He found the line. he separated from Sebulba. Sebulba's pod went spinning into the wall, and Anakin came out of the canyon alone in the lead, and the crowd on its feet did not yet understand that they were watching the Chosen One fulfill his first small step in a story that would take decades to complete. He won. He crossed the finish line, and the roar of the crowd went up. And somewhere above the noise, he heard Qui-Gon's voice, steady and quiet as always. Well done. And for just a moment, before the weight of what came next settled in, Anakin Skywalker was simply a 9-year-old boy who had just won the greatest race in the Outer Rim. And it was enough, and it was perfect. The weight came soon enough. Qui-Gon had, through some additional manipulation of the wager, secured not just the ship parts, but Anakin's freedom. Anakin was going to leave Tatooine. He was going to go with Qui-Gon to Coruscant, to the Jedi Temple, to the life that the Force had apparently been preparing for him all along. And his mother was not coming. Shmi was not free. Watto owned her still, and Qui-Gon had exhausted every avenue available to him. There was nothing left to try. She was staying on Tatooine. Anakin found out when Qui-Gon told him that the parts were ready, that the ship would fly, that they needed to leave. And he understood before anyone said it explicitly that his mother's name was not in the plan. He stood very still in the way that children stand when they are absorbing something they don't have the vocabulary for yet. And then he said he needed a moment. He ran back to their dwelling. Shmi was there. They had one of those conversations that can't be described properly in someone else's words, where everything important is communicated not in what's said, but in the long spaces between sentences, in the pressure of hands held, in the way a parent tries to give a child permission to go, even when every part of them wants to say don't. Shmi told him his future lay on the path ahead. She told him not to look back. She told him she was proud of him, in a way that meant, I have been proud of you from the moment you were born, and I will be proud of you until I stop breathing. He cried. She held him, and then she let him go. He ran back to the ship. He ran because if he had walked, he might have stopped and never started again. And at the last moment, as the ship was powering up, a dark figure came out of the dunes on a speeder bike, a tattooed face, a red saber, igniting an attack on Qui-Gon that lasted only seconds before the Jedi was on board and the ship was rising. The attacker vanished back into the desert. Nobody aboard the ship knew what it meant yet, except that something that had been hiding in the dark had just shown its face. As Tatooine shrank below him and the stars spread out above, Anakin pressed his face to the viewport and watched the planet go. He was leaving the only home he had ever known. His mother was down there, and he had promised her he would come back and free her. And he was 9 years old and had no idea how he would ever be able to do that. And the certainty that he had to was already lodged somewhere deep in his chest where it would stay, pressurizing for years. Coruscant was everything Tatooine was not. It was vertical where Tatooine was flat, silver where Tatooine was gold, cold where Tatooine burned, alive in a way that desert could never manage, with its billions of lights and its layer upon layer of civilization, extending so far down that the bottom levels had not seen natural light in centuries. Anakin had never seen so many people in one place. He had never seen speeder lanes running 30 deep in every direction. He had never seen a building tall enough that its top disappeared into clouds. He pressed his face against the window of the transport and tried to take it all in, and couldn't. And the impossibility of taking it all in was itself thrilling. The Jedi Temple sat at the heart of the city like a different kind of structure. Entirely 4 spires rising from a broader base, built not to impress but to anchor, as if the temple's purpose was to press the Force into the ground of Coruscant and keep the city from floating away entirely. Inside, it was quieter than Anakin had expected. The Jedi moved through the halls with a particular kind of stillness, as if they were always slightly separate from the urgency of the world outside. Anakin walked among them feeling very small and very dusty, and very much like someone who had arrived at a party they were not sure they were invited to. The Jedi Council was a circular room near the top of one of the spires, 12 masters arranged in a circle, and the view beyond the windows was of the entire city spread below like a dream someone had drawn without erasing. Anakin stood in the center of the circle and looked at the beings arranged around him. Yoda, ancient and enormous in his smallness, eyes that had seen centuries of things. Mace Windu, still and contained and watching, with the particular attention of someone who trusts nothing until they have examined it thoroughly and tried not to show how frightened he was. They tested him. They showed him images on a small screen and asked him what he saw before the image appeared, and he answered each one correctly. It was not a trick or a performance. He simply knew. The Force knew, and he was the vessel. And the answers came through him before he consciously reached for them. The masters exchanged glances that he could read, even at 9 years old, even without the Force. They were impressed, and they were troubled, and those 2 things were not as far apart as he might have hoped. Then came the harder part. Master Yoda spoke to him, not about his abilities, but about what he was feeling. Anakin told the truth. He was missing his mother. He was worried about her. The worry was a constant, low-level hum that he couldn't quiet. Yoda listened and nodded and said something that stayed with Anakin for the rest of his life, though not in the way Yoda intended. He said that Anakin's attachment was a problem. That fear of loss was a path to the dark side. That a Jedi must release what they love. The words were not wrong, exactly, but they were also the opening sentences of a conversation the Jedi Order never finished having with Anakin Skywalker. They told him the danger of attachment. They never taught him what to do with it. They named his wound without offering a treatment, and that incomplete conversation, fear named but never healed, attachment identified but never understood, would echo through everything that followed. The council convened and returned its verdict. Anakin Skywalker would not be trained. He was too old. He was too attached. There was too much fear in him, and fear was the entrance to something they were not willing to risk. The decision was final. Qui-Gon did not accept it. He stood before them and told them that Anakin was the chosen one, that the Force had led him to this boy for a reason, that to turn away from that was to turn away from the will of the Force itself. The council told him firmly that they had made their decision. Qui-Gon told them that in that case he would train Anakin himself. He was reminded that he already had an apprentice. He replied that his apprentice was ready for the trials. This was the kind of defiance that Qui-Gon Jinn had made into an art form, not anger, not rebellion, but quiet, immovable conviction. He had been right about things before in ways the council had initially rejected. He was not going to fold on this one. And Anakin, watching this master go to war for him in the most measured and respectful way imaginable, felt something shift. No one had ever done that before. No one had ever put their career on the line for him. had ever insisted on his worth, in a room full of powerful people who were inclined to dismiss it. He filed that moment away somewhere important. The decision was deferred. Queen Amidala had decided to return to Naboo and fight for her people directly, rather than wait for the Senate's endless procedural wheels to turn. The Jedi were needed to protect her. The question of Anakin's future could wait until after. The battle for Naboo was a layered thing. The Gungan army drawing the droid forces into the plains, while the Queen and her guards moved through the palace to capture the Trade Federation leadership, while Qui-Gon and his Padawan Obi-Wan Kenobi dealt with what waited for them in the hangar. The tattooed figure from the Tatooine desert was there. Darth Maul's Sith apprentice, warrior trained from childhood to be a living weapon. He ignited a double-bladed lightsaber, and Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan moved forward together to face him. Anakin sat in a starfighter in the hangar and tried to stay out of the way as he had been told to. And then, events overtook the instructions he had been given. R2-D2 was with him, and the fighter's autopilot engaged in the chaos. And suddenly, he was in the air. And then, he was in space. And then he was inside the Trade Federation's droid control ship, doing something that would have seemed impossible if you didn't know what was moving through his hands. What happened in the hangar was not something he could fully process until later. When the battle was over and there was time to be still, the fight had separated into sections. Force fields isolating Obi-Wan from his master, Qui-Gon facing Maul alone in a corridor, while his Padawan watched from behind an energy barrier and could not reach him. When the field dropped and the battle resumed, it lasted only moments. Maul's saber found a gap in Qui-Gon's guard. A single thrust, Qui-Gon Jinn went down on the floor of the power generator complex. And that was that. Obi-Wan killed Maul shortly after, cut him in half, in a moment of grief-fueled focus that he would not be entirely proud of later, having felt the anger in himself that the blow required. But Maul was gone, and Qui-Gon was dying, and Obi-Wan crawled to his master's side on the floor of that humming room and held him, and Qui-Gon used the last breath he had to ask one thing: train the boy. Obi-Wan said he would. He promised. Qui-Gon Jinn died, and the Force absorbed him, and the room was quiet. Anakin did not see this moment. He was still in space, still inside the droid control ship, still doing something extraordinary with a starfighter that had no business being inside an enemy vessel at all. He destroyed the ship's reactor from inside it, escaped before the explosion consumed him, and emerged into clear space to find the battle over. The droid armies across Naboo suddenly deactivated, the enemy fleet breaking apart. He had not meant to end the battle. He had simply followed the thread of what was possible and kept pulling on it, and it had unraveled into something decisive. He landed to find Obi-Wan Kenobi waiting for him, with a face that told him everything before a word was spoken. Qui-Gon's funeral pyre burned in the courtyard of the Theed Palace, and Anakin stood beside it and watched the fire and felt the shape of loss in a new way. He had lost things before. He had been losing his mother slowly since the moment he understood what it meant to be a slave and unable to change that. But he had never stood at the edge of a fire and watched a person who had believed in him be committed to ash. Qui-Gon had crossed the galaxy to find him, had staked his credibility on him, had defied the council for him, had used his last breath to ensure that the promise of his future would be honored. And now, he was gone. Obi-Wan, standing beside him, told him quietly that the council had reconsidered. Anakin would be trained. He would begin as Obi-Wan's Padawan, and Anakin looked up from the fire at this young man, barely an adult, newly knighted by a grief-struck council in the shadow of his master's death, and felt gratitude and something more complicated. The awareness that the person who would now shape him was himself shaped by loss, was carrying the weight of a promise made to a dying man, was in some way leading Anakin into the future, not purely because he believed in it, but because he owed it to the person who had. There was a child at the funeral, a boy of about 14, standing slightly apart from the delegation from Coruscant, watching the fire with an expression that was difficult to read. He caught Anakin's eye briefly. Anakin would not learn until much later who this boy was. He was Sheev Palpatine, Senator of Naboo, newly elected Supreme Chancellor of the Republic. He was also Darth Sidious. He was also, in ways that would not become clear for another decade, the architect of everything that had brought Anakin Skywalker to this courtyard. He had been watching the boy from Tatooine since the moment Qui-Gon's report had reached him through the complicated channels of his intelligence network. He had been thinking about what Anakin Skywalker might someday become. He placed a hand on Anakin's shoulder that night and told the boy he would be watching his career with great interest. Anakin did not think about that later, or not consciously. He had other things to think about. He was going to be a Jedi. The years that followed were not easy ones. Training never is, and Anakin's training carried the additional weight of everything that made it complicated before it started. He was older than initiates were supposed to be when they began. He had memories and attachments and a history that other Padawans had been carefully prevented from accumulating. He had a mother on a desert planet who was still a slave, and the thought of her pressed against him in quiet moments, the way a bruise presses when you touch it, dull and constant and impossible to ignore. He threw himself into training with an intensity that impressed and sometimes alarmed the knights and masters who worked with him. He was not simply talented. He was ferocious. He treated every exercise, every drill, every sparring session as if something was at stake beyond the lesson itself. His force scores were unprecedented. His lightsaber form progressed at rates that required his teachers to recalibrate what they thought was possible. He absorbed technique the way dry ground absorbs rain completely and immediately. There was never a question of whether he could do the thing. The question was always whether he could learn to do it with the right intention, the right spirit, the steadiness that separated power from danger. Obi-Wan Kenobi was, in many ways, the wrong teacher for Anakin Skywalker. This is not a criticism of Obi-Wan, who was an extraordinary Jedi and a decent man, and who loved his apprentice deeply in the reserved and sometimes exasperating way that Jedi were taught to love, with one hand always extended and the other kept carefully behind the fruste back. But Obi-Wan was 25 years old and had never trained anyone. He was himself still learning who he was as a Jedi Knight, working out which parts of Qui-Gon's teaching he would carry forward and which he would respectfully set aside. And he had been handed the most powerful Force user in the history of the Order and told to prepare him for a destiny that nobody fully understood. The Jedi Council watched this pairing with the cautious attention of people who have placed a significant bet on an uncertain outcome. They checked in regularly. They reviewed Anakin's progress reports with the particular thoroughness reserved for things that could become problems. They were not wrong to be careful. Anakin's power was not the issue. It exceeded all prediction, and that was remarkable rather than threatening in itself. What troubled them was subtler. He did not become more at peace as he grew stronger. He did not develop the equanimity that training was supposed to cultivate. He grew more capable and more restless simultaneously. as if the training that was meant to channel his energy was instead concentrating it, pressurizing it, making it more volatile rather than less. Master Yoda watched him with something between admiration and concern. The way you might watch a fire that is giving warmth you need but burning closer to the walls than you're comfortable with. He did his best. His best was genuinely remarkable. He was consistent and principled, and patient in ways that surprised people who expected less from someone so young. He corrected Anakin's excesses, of which there were many, with a firmness that was intended to be loving even when it didn't always feel that way to the recipient. He taught Anakin the forms and the philosophy and the discipline that the Jedi Code required. He was present. He was there, but there was a distance between them that neither could quite close. Obi-Wan communicated care through instruction, through assessment, through the satisfaction of a problem solved correctly, not through the kind of warmth that Anakin's particular hunger required. And Anakin's hunger was significant. He needed, in a way, that the Jedi Order was philosophically opposed to be loved without conditions, to have someone in his life who would not qualify their attachment with reminders about the Jedi Code. Obi-Wan gave him everything the Code allowed, and some things it didn't. And it was not enough. And neither of them had the language to name the gap. They fought constantly. Not with anger, Obi-Wan was rarely angry, but with the particular friction of two people who fundamentally disagree about how much caution is appropriate. Anakin felt held back. He felt that his abilities were being throttled by an excess of procedure, that the Jedi were wrapping him in restrictions designed for ordinary Force users and not for whatever he was. He was probably right about some of this. He was also probably not as ready as he believed himself to be. Both things were true simultaneously, which is how it usually goes. He was exceptional in the field. His early missions with Obi-Wan established a pattern that would hold throughout his Padawan years. Things would go sideways in ways the briefing had not anticipated. Anakin would improvise in ways the manual did not sanction, and they would survive the improvisation by a margin that Obi-Wan would immediately classify as too narrow and Anakin would classify as fine. There were missions to worlds that had never seen a Jedi before. Negotiations that became firefights before the first sentence was finished. Escapes from situations that shouldn't have had escapes. On Anshan, brokering a secession treaty that nobody wanted brokered, Anakin talked down 3 separate armed confrontations in a single afternoon through a combination of Force persuasion and what could only be described as sheer stubbornness, a refusal to accept the confrontation at face value, to push past the anger and find the fear underneath it. On a separatist-aligned world, whose name has been lost to the grinding of wartime records, he and Obi-Wan were captured and held for 6 days before Anakin dismantled the lock on their cell, using a technique that wasn't in any manual because it required feeling the mechanism at a molecular level rather than seeing it. Obi-Wan asked him afterward how he had managed it. Anakin shrugged and said it just felt like the right direction to push. This drove Obi-Wan mildly insane on a regular basis. He had an instinct for finding the solution that existed in the space between the rules, not lawless, not reckless, but genuinely creative in a way that more conventional Jedi couldn't access. The Force moved through him differently than it moved through other Jedi. Less like water flowing in a channel and more like weather. You could feel when it was coming. You could not always predict where it would land. And somewhere in those years, underneath all of it, the image of a girl from Naboo stayed with him. She had been standing in the desert at the edge of a sandstorm, and she had looked at him with curious dark eyes. And she had told him he was a funny little boy. And he had told her she was an angel, the kind of beings that spacers spoke of, with reverence, beings made of light. And she had smiled at him in a way that he had never been able to fully file away into the archive of the past. Padme Amidala, the queen, who was a handmaiden, who was actually the queen. He had been 9 years old. He had carried her face with him across 10 years of training and missions and growth. And the carrying had meant something he couldn't quite name. And he was not supposed to name it anyway, and so he didn't. In 22 BBY, someone tried to kill her. Padme had become a senator in the years since Naboo had served her 2 terms as queen, and then moved into the Republic's larger political arena, where she was quickly recognized as formidable and principled and inconveniently resistant to the kinds of compromise that corrupt systems depend on. She was leading opposition to a military creation act that Chancellor Palpatine was quietly working to pass through the Senate, and someone who wanted that act to pass had decided it would be easier to remove the opposition than to defeat it. The first assassination attempt came as she landed on Coruscant. A bomb disguised as a gift from a Naboo dignitary detonated in her landing party, killing several of her guards. She survived because one of her handmaidens, who often served as a decoy for exactly these situations, was in her place. The second attempt came that same night in her quarters. 2 venomous creatures released through the window that would have killed her in her sleep. Obi-Wan and Anakin were assigned to protect her. Anakin was 22 years old, and Padme was 24. And when they stood in the same room together for the first time in a decade, something happened that both of them would spend considerable energy pretending wasn't happening. She remembered him as the little boy from Tatooine. She did not, at first, see the man he had become, tall and earnest, and carrying the particular confidence of someone who has been told since childhood that they are extraordinary and has spent a decade trying to live up to it. He saw her and felt everything he had spent 10 years carefully not feeling. And it arranged itself on his face in a way that apparently Obi-Wan noticed immediately, with the resigned expression of someone who has been anticipating a problem and is not surprised by its arrival. They were sent to Naboo for her protection, while Obi-Wan followed the thread of the assassination attempts. Naboo was the wrong place to send them if the goal was to keep Anakin's feelings in a manageable compartment. It was beautiful in the particular way that only planets with things worth dying for can be rolling green hills and golden fields and water that fell in silver curtains from cliffs into blue lakes, and the city of Theed rising out of all of it like something dreamed rather than built. Anakin had grown up in a world without beauty of this kind, and being in it with her was not fair to either of them. They talked. They had time, and they used it. And conversations in beautiful places have a way of going deeper than conversations in plain rooms. She told him about her work and her beliefs and the things she found worth protecting. The Republic, she had come to realize, was more fragile than it appeared from the inside. The people on 100 worlds whose lives depended on institutions doing what institutions were not fundamentally designed to do, which was to be genuinely good. She had a particular kind of idealism that was not naivety. She had seen too much to be naive, but was more like a decision, a choice made fresh every morning to believe that the structures of civilization could be made worth the sacrifice they demanded. Anakin found this extraordinary. He had grown up outside every structure the Republic claimed to protect. He did not share her faith in institutions. but he found himself moved by the depth of her commitment to them. By the way, she spoke of the Senate's failures, not with cynicism, but with the precise frustration of someone who expected better because they knew better was possible. He told her things he did not say to other people about growing up as a slave, about his mother, about the loneliness of being different in ways that couldn't be explained. He was not performing vulnerability. He was genuinely vulnerable, in the way that people are when they are around someone they have carried in memory for a decade and who has turned out to be even more than the memory. She kept reminding him of the rules. They couldn't. He was a Jedi. She was a senator. It was impossible. And then she would say something honest and look at him directly, and her own face would arrange itself into an expression that said, "I know, and I can't stop it either." And then the nightmares came. They had been there in a muted form for years. Brief images, the sense of his mother's presence, a quality of suffering in the dream that he would push away on waking. On Naboo, they grew worse. He dreamed of Shmi with a clarity that felt less like dreaming and more like something the Force was trying to tell him. She was in pain. She was somewhere dark and frightened. She needed him. He couldn't go to her. He was on assignment. Obi-Wan would not approve. The Jedi Council would not approve. There was a mission and a senator to protect, and the correct thing to do was to stay. He stayed as long as he could. And then he told Padme that he had to go, that something was wrong with his mother, that he could not go. And Padme, who understood loss and duty in equal measure, did not tell him he was wrong. She told him she was coming with him. They flew to Tatooine. They found Watto first, in his shop, and learned that he had sold Shmi 3 years earlier. A moisture farmer from the outer edges of the Mos Eisley area had come in and paid off her debt and eventually married her. Her name now was Shmi Lars, and the Lars homestead was a half-day's journey into the desert. The Lars homestead was the kind of place that Tatooine made people build, sunk partly underground to escape the suns, practical and spare and modest in everything except its stubbornness in existing at all. Cliegg Lars met them in the courtyard. He was in a chair, having lost his leg in the desert. His son, Owen, and Owen's girlfriend Beru were there, and Cliegg told them what had happened a month before. Shmi had gone out early one morning to pick mushrooms at the moisture vaporators at the edge of their property. She did that sometimes, in the quiet hours. She hadn't come back. They had found the evidence of what had taken her Tusken Raiders, a large group of them, fresh tracks leading into the deep desert. Cliegg had organized a party of 30 settlers to go after her. 4 of them had come back. He told Anakin she was probably already dead. He told him he was sorry. He told him that this was Tatooine and Tusken Raiders were what they were. Anakin rode out into the desert that night on one of the speeder bikes from the homestead. He rode toward the cluster of Tusken camps he had helped identify from the Lars family's knowledge of the area, following something that was not quite the Force and not quite instinct, but the particular combination of the two that Qui-Gon had tried to teach him to trust. He rode for hours, and the desert night was cold in the way that desert nights always are. And the stars above him were the same stars he had looked up at as a child and thought meant freedom, and he did not think about any of that. He thought only about finding her. He found her. The camp was a collection of tents and covered structures in a canyon sheltered from the wind. and he moved through it with a silence that the Force provided and a ruthlessness that his need provided. And in the largest tent, hung by her arms from a wooden structure, was his mother. She was barely conscious. She had been beaten repeatedly over the course of a month, and the damage was extensive in ways that told him instantly this was not going to be a rescue. This was going to be a farewell. He cut her down. He held her. She opened her eyes and looked at him, saw him, actually saw him, knew it was him, and he said he was there. He had come for her. He would take her home. She smiled at him. She told him she loved him. She told him she was proud. And then she died. In his arms. After everything. The thing that came out of Anakin Skywalker in that tent is difficult to describe from the outside. Grief is one word for it, and rage is another, and neither is sufficient. It was something older and more absolute than either of those things. The specific anguish of a person who has been trying to save someone for years and has arrived in time to watch them go, who has promised to protect them and found the promise broken not through any failure of effort, but through simple, terrible timing. It was the moment when the fear of loss, which the Council had named and the training had tried to contain, became not fear but fact. He ignited his lightsaber. He killed every Tusken Raider in that camp. Not in self-defense, not in the heat of combat. He went through that camp with a deliberateness that is, in its own way, more terrible than pure rage would have been. Men first, then the women, then the children. He was there for a long time. What he did in that camp is the kind of act that certain scholars of the Force have spent decades trying to explain, and the truth is that no explanation fully satisfies. He had crossed a line that the Jedi Code existed specifically to prevent crossing, had used the Force not to protect or to preserve, or even to punish in any defensible sense, but to exterminate. And he knew it, in some level below the grief, in the part of him that was still the boy who had built a droid to keep his mother company and had wanted nothing more complicated than to help. He knew what he had done. He would not be able to unknow it. It would live inside him from that moment as a fact about himself that he could not incorporate cleanly into the story of who he was, a splinter, working its way deeper, never quite surfacing, never quite resolving. Years later, Obi-Wan would say that this was the moment when the dark side touched Anakin for the first time, really touched him. Not the brushes and tremors of a person with powerful emotions navigating a demanding life, but the genuine grip of it. He would say that he could feel the change across the bond they shared as Padawan and Master, that something shifted in Anakin from that night, and never quite shifted back. Whether this is true is difficult to say from the outside. What is certain is that Anakin himself felt the change. He never spoke of it in those terms, but he knew. He brought his mother's body back to the Lars homestead on the speeder bike. Across the desert, in the dark, Klieg Lars helped him dig a grave, and they buried Shmi Skywalker Lars in the sand behind the house at dawn. And Anakin stood at the edge of that grave and looked at the mound of earth, and felt something solidify inside him that had previously been uncertain. He told Padme what he had done. All of it. He did not edit. He was not looking for absolution. He said he had killed them. All of them. That they were like animals, and he had slaughtered them like animals, and that he hated them for what they did. His voice broke. He wept. He told her that he knew it was wrong, but he also couldn't quite make himself feel that it was wrong. And the gap between knowing and feeling was terrifying. Padme held him. She did not tell him he was a monster. She did not tell him he was forgiven. She held him in the way that people hold someone whose grief has become too large for comfort, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't be a lie. They had received a message from Obi-Wan before the burial. He had tracked the assassination attempt to a droid foundry on the planet Geonosis, had found the Separatist leadership gathered there with Count Dooku at its center, and had been captured in the process. The message was a warning and a coordinate. The Council had received it too, and Mace Windu was leading a strike team. Anakin and Padme were closest. They went. Because there was nothing else to do with the grief, and because Obi-Wan needed them, and because the galaxy had not paused to acknowledge what had just happened in the desert and was not going to. Geonosis was a red rock planet, dry and alien. Its surface the color of old blood. Its droid foundries had been running in secret for years, producing the separatist forces that were about to make the Clone Wars inevitable. Anakin and Padme infiltrated the foundry and were captured almost immediately, which was less a failure of planning than a consequence of having gone in with grief-raw reflexes and an urgency that made caution feel like an insult. They were sentenced to death. The execution was to be public Geonosian spectacle in an outdoor arena, the three prisoners chained to pillars and released to the arena's creatures. Obi-Wan was already there when they arrived. He managed a wry greeting despite the circumstances, which was very Obi-Wan, the capacity to find a note of irony in situations that fully merited horror. In the stands above the arena, more than 200 Jedi were waiting. Mace Windu, seated near the Geonosian leaders, turned to them very calmly and ignited his lightsaber. What followed was the largest gathering of Jedi in combat in living memory. And it was also a defeat being held together by determination and desperate improvisation, because even 200 Jedi were not enough against the tens of thousands of battle droids that the foundries could produce. Fewer than 30 of the strike force survived the arena itself. At the moment when it seemed that everything was going to end there on that red sand, the sky darkened, and the first gunships of the new clone army arrived, and Master Yoda brought the war that Sidious had been engineering for a decade. Anakin and Obi-Wan went after Count Dooku, former Jedi Master, now the public face of the separatist movement, now revealed as the Sith Lord called Darth Tyrannus, who had orchestrated the assassinations and the droid army and the entire machinery of the conflict now detonating across the galaxy. The duel was brief and decisive in the worst way. Dooku was faster and more skilled than either of them had been willing to believe. He took Obi-Wan out of the fight with contemptuous efficiency and turned his full attention to Anakin, and Anakin came at him with everything he had, and everything he had was not enough. Dooku severed his arm at the elbow, and Anakin went down hard. Yoda arrived in time to prevent the worst. Dooku escaped. Anakin's right arm was replaced with a mechanical prosthetic at a medical facility before they left Geonosis. He flexed the new fingers and felt them respond and watched them work without sensation, without warmth, and thought something he did not say aloud. A week later, on Naboo, in a garden by the water, Anakin Skywalker and Padme Amidala were married in a quiet ceremony attended by R2-D2 and C-3PO, the protocol droid Anakin had built in a slave's workshop from salvaged parts and carried across the galaxy in his own memory. It was not legal under Jedi code. It was not something he could tell anyone about. It was, on every official and institutional level, impossible. It was also the thing he had wanted most in the world. And he held her hands and said the words and meant every syllable. The water moved behind them, and the light was gold, and the afternoon was warm, and Anakin Skywalker, the boy from Tatooine who had dreamed of freedom and found something more complicated and more precious than any freedom he had imagined, was 22 years old and married and going to war. The war that followed would last 3 years, and it would make him a legend, and it would hollow him out in ways that the legend deliberately omitted, and by the end of it, nothing would be as it had been. Not the Republic, not the Jedi, and not Anakin. But that is a story for the next chapter of a life that was always going to be too large for any single telling. The Clone Wars began the way most catastrophes begin, with a single event that was both shocking and, in retrospect, entirely predictable for anyone who had been paying attention to the right things. The Battle of Geonosis was not the start of anything. It was the end of the beginning. Darth Sidious had spent a decade arranging pieces on a board so vast that no single intelligence could have seen the whole of it. And when the pieces finally moved, they moved all at once. The clone army deployed, the separatist droid forces responding, 100 systems choosing sides in a conflict that was not, at its heart, about any of the things either side claimed it was about. Anakin Skywalker was 22 years old when the Clone Wars began. He was given the rank of Jedi Knight and the command of the 501st Legion of clone troopers, and he walked into that war with the particular combination of gifts that made him genuinely dangerous in the field and genuinely unpredictable everywhere else. He was fast, he was powerful, he was creative in ways that battle doctrine could not contain and that his enemies could not anticipate. And he was, beneath all of it, a person running from grief, which is its own kind of fuel, consuming and relentless, and capable of powering extraordinary things right up until the moment it burns the engine out. The 501st became something different under his command than it had been designed to be. Clone troopers were trained to follow orders, to execute doctrine, to function as interchangeable units in a military machine whose designers had never intended them to have relationships with their officers. Anakin refused this design. He learned the clones' names. He learned what they were good at and what they were afraid of, and which ones needed encouragement before a difficult action, and which ones needed to be left alone to find their own courage. He ate with them. He fought beside them in a way that put him consistently at the front of engagements rather than in the command position behind the line, which horrified every military analyst who reviewed the records and explained, in part, why his troops would follow him anywhere. Captain Rex was his second in command, and in Rex, Anakin found something he had not expected to find in a manufactured soldier bred for war: genuine partnership. Rex was not Anakin's subordinate who happened to have good instincts. Rex was a peer in everything that actually mattered in tactical judgment, in the ability to read a situation and adapt faster than the doctrine allowed, in the particular courage that comes not from not being afraid but from choosing to act anyway. They argued frequently and productively, and trusted each other's assessments in ways that made their joint operations a kind of controlled chaos that consistently produced results no conventional analysis could have predicted. Rex would follow Anakin into impossible situations without flinching. Anakin would consider Rex's objections seriously, even when he ultimately overrode them. Between them, they evolved a style of warfare that was not in any manual and was entirely, unmistakably theirs. The Clone Wars were supposed to be about something: the Republic fighting for its survival, the Jedi serving as the sword of civilization, the forces of democracy holding the line against a separatist movement that threatened to fracture the galaxy. This was the story. Anakin believed it. At the beginning, with the wholehearted conviction of someone who needs to believe in something large enough to justify the cost of what he is doing. He was good at war. He did not particularly like being good at war. The Jedi Code told him that was the right attitude to have, and in this case the code was right, though for reasons more complicated than the code was designed to explain. The thing about being at war for 3 years is that it changes you in ways that accumulate faster than you can account for them. The first time you kill someone in battle, you carry it. The 100th time, you are already a different person than the person who first carried it. And the thing you are carrying has changed its shape, become less sharp and more dense, less like a wound and more like an added weight that you move differently to accommodate. Anakin felt this. He was not the kind of person who could go numb. The Force would not allow it, and his own nature would not allow it. And so he carried every engagement fully, felt every loss in the Force as a specific and particular pain, and kept going anyway, because stopping was not one of the options available to him. He crossed lines during the Clone Wars that he did not discuss in his after-action reports. Not many. He was not a war criminal. And the distinction matters, but some. There were interrogations that went longer than they should have. There were threats made to obtain intelligence that were not quite threats. There were moments when the Force moved through him, not in the clean, controlled way of a Jedi in meditation, but in the ragged, urgent way of someone who needed answers and was going to get them. He knew when it happened. He always knew. He filed it and moved forward and tried not to think about what the filing was costing him. And then, before the first year of the war was done, Yoda arrived at his camp with news. He was being assigned a Padawan. Her name was Ahsoka Tano. She was 14 years old, a Togruta with orange skin and white facial markings, and a set of blue and white head tails that moved when she was thinking. She was also, immediately and emphatically, the most annoying person Anakin had been asked to work with since Obi-Wan's worst days, which was saying something. She was confident past the edge of what her experience justified, quick with observations that were accurate enough to be irritating, and delivered with a directness that she had not yet learned to soften. She called him Sky Guy within approximately 30 minutes of their introduction, which he found aggravating and which became, over time, one of the words in the galaxy with the most warmth attached to it. He had not wanted a Padawan. He had said so clearly and been overruled. He understood the reason a teacher who has to teach must also learn, and there were things the Order hoped the responsibility of training another would develop in Anakin, that the war had not, but understanding a reason is not the same as accepting it. And he took Ahsoka on with the resigned energy of someone who intends to fulfill an obligation correctly, even if they cannot quite make themselves want it. He changed his mind inside the first mission. Not all at once. It was not a conversion moment, but incrementally, in the way that people change their minds about things that matter, through accumulated evidence that their initial position was wrong. Ahsoka was brave in a way that was distinct from his own bravery, less fueled by grief and urgency, and more by a genuine love of the challenge itself. She was funny. She was loyal past the point where loyalty was easy. She made mistakes and learned from them at a speed that would have impressed Obi-Wan, and she refused to let those mistakes define her in ways that Anakin found both admirable and, privately, instructive. She was teaching him things about failure, about how to be wrong and still move forward. He was not yet able to apply those lessons to himself, but he was absorbing them. He called her Snips. She called him Sky Guy. And somewhere in the second year of the war, when they had been through enough together that the accounting of it would fill volumes, he admitted to himself what he had been denying. He loved her. Not as a project or an obligation, not even as a teacher loves a student, in the measured and appropriate way the code approved. He loved her the way you love someone you have chosen, the way you love family that you made rather than inherited. She was his. And the awareness of that, for a person whose deepest wounds all came from losing people they loved, was not entirely comfortable. There was a mission in the second year to the planet Mortis that none of them discussed openly afterward. It is worth discussing now. Mortis was not a place by any ordinary definition. It was something more like a pocket of the Force, a region of space that operated by different rules, where time moved strangely, and the Force itself was present not as a background hum, but as something close to an atmosphere, something you moved through rather than something you drew from. The Father, the Son, and the Daughter, three beings of extraordinary force power, older than any civilization Anakin had encountered, lived there in a balance of light and dark that the Father spent his existence maintaining. He had drawn Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Ahsoka there deliberately. The Father believed Anakin was the chosen one. He wanted Anakin to take his place, to remain on Mortis and maintain the balance between his children, the light-aligned daughter and the dark-aligned son, to keep them contained, to be, in effect, a prison warden for the embodiments of the Force's fundamental nature. Anakin refused. But the cost of that refusal was not simply leaving. The son, dark, hungry, ancient in his corruption, showed Anakin something before the daughter's sacrifice closed the crisis. He showed him a vision, his future, Darth Vader, fully formed, in the black armor, burning worlds, standing over the galaxy as its tyrant, the clones carrying out his orders in the Jedi Temple, the faces of people he loved extinguished. He saw it all, and it was not a symbol or a metaphor. It was specific. It was real. The sun reached into Anakin's mind and tipped him briefly into darkness, into the thing he would become, fed just enough despair to make the transformation feel inevitable rather than chosen. Anakin fought his way back from it, with Obi-Wan's help and Ahsoka's. And when the crisis on Mortis ended and they left the strange world behind, something was done to the memory. They could not fully recall the details. The specifics faded like a dream at noon, but the feeling stayed. The echo of what he had seen stayed, and somewhere in the architecture of his fear, a new room had been opened, furnished with the certainty that he was capable of becoming something monstrous. He could not remember exactly what he had seen. He knew it was terrible. He knew it was him. He flew back to the war and said nothing about it to anyone. And the war continued. And Palpatine waited. Palpatine had been cultivating Anakin since the day on Naboo, when he placed his hand on the boy's shoulder and said he would be watching his career with great interest. It had been a long cultivation, patient and sophisticated, and conducted with the care of someone who understood that the thing they were growing required the right conditions and could not be rushed. He positioned himself as the one adult in Anakin's world who was not restricted by the Jedi Code in what he could offer. He praised Anakin where the Council criticized. He listened where the Order lectured. He expressed confidence in Anakin's judgment at precisely the moments when the Council was expressing concern about it. He made himself indispensable as a confidant by being the only one who did not ask Anakin to be less than he was, or so it seemed, which was a very different thing, carefully constructed to feel the same. They met regularly during the Clone Wars. Palpatine would call Anakin to his office for what he characterized as briefings, and which functioned as something closer to therapy sessions in which the Chancellor of the Republic listened to a Jedi general describe his frustrations and his fears with an attentiveness that Anakin could not find elsewhere. Palpatine never told him what he wanted to hear, not exactly. He was too skilled for that. He asked questions designed to lead Anakin to conclusions he was already approaching, gave the conclusions the warmth of a discovery made rather than a suggestion accepted. He talked about the Force in ways that the Jedi Order never had about its power, about what it meant to be exceptional within it, about the dark side, not as a corruption to be feared, but as a dimension to be understood. He planted seeds and watered them over years, and never once asked Anakin to acknowledge that anything was being planted. And he waited for the dream. The dream came toward the end of the war. In the last months before Grievous was found, and the end game began, Anakin dreamed of Padme dying in childbirth. The dreams were specific and physical in the way Force visions are not metaphors, but previews. The Force trying to show him something real. He woke from them in cold sweat and lay in the dark on whatever ship or camp cot was his bed that week and felt the shape of it. Padme was pregnant, and he had seen her die, and everything that had happened with his mother, the dreams first. And then the reality told him exactly how seriously to take what the Force was showing him. This was the fault line that Palpatine had been moving toward for a decade. Not the war, not the politics, not the temptation of power for its own sake. Anakin was not particularly interested in power for its own sake, and Palpatine knew it. The fault line was this: the fear of losing someone he loved, the terror of arriving too late again, the knowledge that the galaxy was vast and death was everywhere, and the people he could not afford to lose were fragile in ways that his strength could not simply prevent. Palpatine told him about Darth Plagueis. He told it as a story, as a legend of the Sith, a wise and powerful Dark Lord who had mastered the midi-chlorians themselves, who had discovered a technique for influencing life and death directly, who had learned to prevent those he loved from dying. He told it carefully, layering the implication beneath the anecdote, giving Anakin time to hear the subtext without needing it spoken aloud. The dark side, Palpatine suggested, was a pathway to abilities that some might consider unnatural. Abilities the Jedi would never teach him. Abilities that could, perhaps, be used to save a person the Force had shown him dying. Anakin did not say yes. He was not there yet, but he listened, and the listening was its own kind of answer. The Battle of Coruscant came as a shock and a provocation simultaneously. General Grievous, the cyborg warlord who served as the Separatists' most feared military commander, had penetrated to the capital itself and kidnapped Chancellor Palpatine directly from the heart of the Republic's government. It was audacious to the point of impossibility, and it worked. Anakin and Obi-Wan were recalled immediately to lead the rescue. The space battle above Coruscant was one of the largest in the war. Hundreds of ships exchanging fire across an orbital theater, while two Jedi threaded a fighter through it at speeds that required the Force at every moment. They found Palpatine aboard Grievous's command ship, found Count Dooku there as well, and the fight that followed was swift and decisive in a way their previous encounters had not been. Anakin was better than he had been on Geonosis. 3 years of war had compounded his ability in ways that made him something qualitatively different from the Padawan who had lost his arm in that arena. He and Obi-Wan were winning. Obi-Wan went down early, a stunning blow that left him unconscious on the floor of the observation deck. Anakin continued alone, and the duel resolved in seconds. Dooku's lightsabers taken, the man kneeling before him, defenseless, and Palpatine from his chair, still bound, watching, told Anakin to kill him. This is the moment that is easy to judge from the outside and almost impossible to judge fairly from the inside. Anakin knew it was wrong. The thought that it was wrong was present in him as a clear and distinct signal. This is not what a Jedi does. This is an execution, not a duel, and he is already defeated, and it is wrong. He felt that, and then he did it anyway. Palpatine told him it was necessary, told him the war demanded it, told him Dooku was too dangerous to be allowed to live. And Anakin, who was exhausted and frightened and already compromised in ways he had not been accounting for, followed the instruction. He told himself it was the war. He told himself that the war had changed the rules of what was necessary. He took both blades and crossed them, and it was done. He carried that with him differently than he had carried the Tusken camp. The Tusken raiders had been grief and rage turned outward. This was something colder, an act committed with full awareness, in response to a command from someone who had no authority to give it, against a prisoner who had already lost. He had executed a man. He knew what that was. And he continued carrying it, adding it to the weight, moving differently around it, because the war was not over, and there was no alternative to continuing. The political aftermath was swift. Palpatine appointed Anakin as his personal representative on the Jedi Council, an unprecedented arrangement that immediately created the kind of tension that unprecedented arrangements always create. The Council accepted the appointment because refusing it would have been a confrontation with the Chancellor that they were not prepared to have, given the emergency powers the Senate had already granted him, and the mood of a republic that was 3 years into a war it was desperate to end. But they did not give Anakin the rank of master. Think about what this meant. He was placed in a room with the 12 most powerful Jedi in the Order, given a seat among them, the seat that implied equality, and then told explicitly that he did not have the status his presence implied. It was not intended as a humiliation. It was a statement of fact. The rank of master was not something the Council could award politically. It was an assessment of attainment, and they had not concluded that Anakin's attainment warranted it. They were not wrong by their own criteria. That did not make it feel less like a slap. They then told him, privately, that they wanted him to spy on Palpatine, to use his relationship with the Chancellor as an intelligence tool, to report on the man's activities and intentions to a council that was increasingly concerned about where the emergency powers were leading. Anakin felt this as a betrayal in both directions simultaneously. The council was asking him to deceive a man he had known for 15 years, using a relationship built on what Anakin had believed was genuine trust. And Palpatine, if he suspected anything, Palpatine, who had survived decades in political environments that made the average Jedi Council look like an amateur theater group, would not simply be offended. The situation was designed to tear Anakin in two, and he was already not in one piece. He went to Palpatine's office and sat in the chair across from the Chancellor and told him about the Council's request, and immediately hated himself for telling him, because the telling was itself a choice, an alignment, a declaration that his loyalty was to Palpatine over the Council, and he had made it without quite deciding to. Palpatine received the information with the composed equanimity of someone who had already known, and who had been waiting for Anakin to arrive at this exact moment of confession. And then, in that office, Palpatine told him who he was. He told Anakin that he was Darth Sidious, that he had always been Darth Sidious, that everything, the Trade Federation blockade, the Clone Wars, the Separatist movement, the emergency powers, the Military Creation Act, 15 years of Republic politics and galactic crisis had been his design from the beginning, that the war Anakin had spent 3 years fighting, the war in which he had killed and lost and been changed irrevocably, was a performance of conflict constructed by the man sitting across from him, that the Jedi he had served were the intended victims of the entire exercise. And he offered Anakin the knowledge to save Padme. Anakin left the office. He walked through the halls of the Senate building, and he did not know who he was anymore. He had spent 15 years building a self out of specific materials. Jedi Knight, Chosen One, Obi-Wan's Padawan, Padme's husband, the hero with no fear. Those materials had all just been recontextualized simultaneously by a man who had apparently been shaping the context all along. He went to Mace Windu. He reported what Palpatine had told him. He watched Mace assemble a strike team and move toward the Chancellor's office with the purpose of someone who has been waiting for an enemy to reveal himself and is not going to waste the moment. He followed them. He stood outside the office and listened to the sounds of combat and tried to make himself stay where he was. He could not make himself stay where he was. What he found when he pushed through the door was Palpatine in a chair, disfigured by whatever Force lightning had reflected back on him in the duel, and Mace Windu standing over him with a purple blade raised, and Palpatine telling Anakin that he was too weak to continue, that he needed him, that the knowledge to save Padme would die with him if Anakin allowed this. Mace told him to stand aside, told him that Palpatine was too dangerous to be taken prisoner, that the Jedi could not afford the trial that taking him alive would require. Anakin said he could not let him do it. He said Palpatine had to stand trial. Mace said it was not his choice to make. The moment lasted less than a second. Anakin's blade came up and severed Mace Windu's sword hand, and Mace went to his knees, and Palpatine's lightning finished the rest. And Mace Windu went through the window into the Coruscant night, and the man who had called himself a friend for 15 years looked at Anakin with his ruined yellow eyes and said, "What have you done is not important. What you must do next is everything." Anakin Skywalker knelt on the floor of that office and pledged himself to the Sith. He did not feel relief or power or the dark triumph that the moment's narrative might suggest. He felt the specific despair of someone who has just realized they have made a choice they cannot unmake. He told himself that Padme would survive because of this. He told himself that the knowledge Palpatine had promised would be enough. He told himself that what he had just done was not what it was. Palpatine gave him a name, Darth Vader. The name sat on him strangely. He had been Anakin his entire life. A name is not a small thing. It is the word other people use when they think of you, the word you use when you think of yourself, the sound that links identity to existence. Darth Vader was not a person he had ever been. But the person he had just become was not clearly Anakin Skywalker anymore either. He accepted the name the way a person accepts a wound, because it has already happened, and there is nothing to be done except learned to carry it. The First Order was simple and terrible. The clone army, the army he had fought alongside for 3 years, the men he knew by name, the men who called him general with a warmth that the title did not contain, had been waiting for this. The chips in their heads, installed before the war began by a hand Anakin only now understood, activated simultaneously across the galaxy. Order 66. Kill the Jedi. Every Jedi. Everywhere. All at once. Anakin did not give this order. It came from Sidious. But the clones under his own command, the 501st, were given to him for the night's work: march on the Jedi Temple. He did not allow himself to think about it. This was the only way he could do what he was doing. The moment he thought about it, about what the temple meant, about who was inside it, about the younglings who had done nothing, about Obi-Wan, was the moment the weight of it would become impassable. So he did not think. He led, and the 501st followed him through the gates of the temple they had been told to see as the home of traitors. And Anakin Skywalker lit his saber in the halls of the place that had raised him. What happened in the temple that night is not something the history books that the Empire permitted could describe accurately. And the history books that came after the Empire struggled with it for different reasons. The truth is that Anakin killed Jedi in those halls. He killed them efficiently and without the mercy of explanation or choice. He killed masters who had known him since childhood. He killed knights who had flown missions beside him in the war. And then he came to a room where a group of younglings' children, 10 years old, 8 years old, 7 had gathered because they had heard the fighting and had come looking for someone who could tell them what was happening. One of them stepped forward, a small boy with a terrified face, and asked if he could help them. He could have stopped. The door was there. The choice was there. The thing he had been on Naboo and Tatooine, and in every moment of the war when he had used his gifts to protect rather than to harm that person, was still in there, still reachable, still capable of pulling back from the brink. It would have taken one decision, one refusal to continue. He did not stop. There is a particular quality to the way the Force moves around an act of genuine evil committed by someone who knows it is evil and does it anyway. It is not the same as the absence of the Force. The dark side is the Force, in the same way that a storm is weather. It is more like the feeling of something being torn that was load-bearing, like a sound that stops so suddenly you feel its absence as a physical thing. Whatever Anakin Skywalker had been before he walked into that room, he was not that person when he walked out. He flew to Mustafar while the temple burned. Palpatine had sent him to the volcanic planet at the edge of a dying system, because the Separatist Council was there. The leaders of the movement that had fought the Republic for 3 years, who believed they were meeting with Sidious to receive the terms of their reward. They were not there to receive a reward. They were there to be disposed of. The war had served its purpose. The emergency powers were in place. The Senate would accept whatever Palpatine offered because the alternative was chaos. The Separatists were loose ends. Anakin killed them all. He went through that facility systematically, and he killed every member of the Separatist Council. And when it was done, he sat in the control room and looked at the lava flowing outside the windows and tried to feel something other than what he was feeling, which was a kind of hollow devastation that was nothing like the peace Palpatine had promised. Padme came. He had not expected her. She had received some fragment of information about what was happening, what he had done, and she had come anyway. because she was Padme Amidala, and there was a version of the world in which she simply waited for him to come home, and that version had never been the one she chose to live in. She landed and walked out of the ship onto the landing pad above the lava and looked at him with an expression that was love and horror in exact equal measure, which is perhaps the most generous expression anyone who had seen what he had done could have offered. She told him what she had heard. She asked him to stop. She asked him to come away with her, to find Obi-Wan, to find some way back from wherever he had gone. She told him it was not too late. He told her he had done it for her. He told her it had been the only way to keep her safe, to gain the power to save her, to make the galaxy something they could live in without fear. And then he told her that with the new power he had gained, they could overthrow Palpatine together, could rule the galaxy themselves, could build something good from the wreckage of everything that had burned. He meant it. The logic was real to him in that moment. He had committed himself to a path of destruction he believed was leading somewhere worth going. She looked at him and said, "You're breaking my heart." And then Obi-Wan stepped out of the ship. He had been there when she left Coruscant. He had followed her. He knew where she would go and why. Anakin looked at Obi-Wan and at Padme and understood, with a certainty that was not rational and was also not wrong, that she had brought him here, that she had told his former master where to find him. This was not true. Obi-Wan had stowed away, had come without her knowledge, had used her love for Anakin against her in ways she had not intended. But the lie was self-constructed and self-sustaining, and he needed it to be true because the alternative was that Padme was simply here, choosing him, choosing this moment with all its horror. And that was too much to face. He reached out with the Force, and she crumpled. He choked her. He hurt the person he had crossed the galaxy to save. He held it for only seconds before Obi-Wan's voice cut through, and he released her. But the seconds had been enough. She fell unconscious to the landing pad, and R2-D2 caught her. And Anakin turned to face his former master. They fought. The whole of Mustafar seemed to accommodate the scale of it, the gantries and platforms and machines of the Separatist facility becoming the terrain of a duel that was not really about winning or losing in any tactical sense. It was about something older. Two people who had spent years in the closest thing to brotherhood that the war allowed, now standing on opposite sides of a line that Anakin had crossed and Obi-Wan could not follow. Obi-Wan kept talking. Anakin kept fighting. The talk was worse than the fighting in some ways, because Obi-Wan's voice was familiar and grieved, and his argument was not wrong. You were the chosen one. You were supposed to destroy the Sith, not join them. You were supposed to bring balance, not darkness. Anakin raged at him, told him he had been holding him back his entire life, told him he knew better than his master, than the council, than the order. He believed this. The dark side has a particular effect on conviction. It doesn't create belief so much as amplify and distort the ones already present, turning legitimate grievances into unassailable certainties, turning frustration into righteousness. Anakin was not wrong that the council had limited him. He was not wrong that the order had failed him in specific and important ways. But the dark side had taken those truths and arranged them into a justification for everything. And he could not see the difference anymore between the legitimate grievance and the construction built on top of it. He made a mistake near the end. He was faster than Obi-Wan in almost every category of physical combat. Faster reflex, faster recovery, more raw power in the Force. But he had been fighting for hours, and he was not fully in control of himself. And Obi-Wan retreated to the bank of the lava river, and Anakin followed him down, even though from above he could see that Obi-Wan had the high ground. The high ground in a lightsaber duel is not a metaphor, it is geometry. It constrains the angles available to the person attacking from below in ways that a skilled defensive fighter can exploit completely. Obi-Wan warned him. He leaped anyway. What followed was merciful, only in that it was fast. Anakin lost his arm, and both his legs in a single motion fell to the black volcanic sand at the edge of the lava and lay there while his body ignited. The suit would later tell the world that his helmet kept fire from his face, but that is not accurate. His face burned. His lungs burned. The Force itself seemed to take a breath and hold it, watching. Obi-Wan stood above him with a saber he did not use, and an expression on his face that was grief stripped of every softening quality, raw and complete and terrible. He told Anakin that he was his brother, that he had loved him. And then he took Anakin's lightsaber from the sand and climbed back up to the landing pad and took Padme onto the ship and left. He left because he could not kill him. The Jedi Code said he should. The calculation of the war and the Empire and everything Palpatine had set in motion said that leaving Darth Vader alive was a catastrophic strategic error. He left anyway. Whether this was mercy or weakness or something more complex than either of those words accommodates is a question that the subsequent history of the galaxy answered in its own way. Palpatine came to Mustafar and found what remained of his new apprentice. He brought him to a medical facility on Coruscant, and the engineers there did what could be done, which was significant and not enough. New limbs more sophisticated than the mechanical arm that had replaced what he lost at Geonosis, but ultimately the same in principle. Breathing apparatus for lungs that could no longer move enough air on their own. A suit designed to maintain the systems that kept him alive, covering everything that had been destroyed. The suit was black. It was always going to be black. He came back to consciousness on an operating table, and Palpatine was there. And he asked about Padme. He asked if she was alive. He needed her to be alive. The whole architecture of what he had done, the structure of justification that made it survivable to be inside of, required her to be alive, because he had done it to save her. If she was already gone, then everything, the temple, the younglings, Mustafar, all of it had been for nothing. He needed her to not be gone. Palpatine told him she was dead. He told him gently, and with the particular solicitousness of someone who has been anticipating this moment and knows exactly how to use it. He did not tell Anakin that the Force lightning that had damaged his suit as he was being rebuilt had killed her. He did not tell Anakin that some theorists would later suggest she had died, at least partly, of what Anakin himself had done to her on that landing pad. He simply said, "She is gone. Your anger killed her." The newly built Darth Vader sat up on the table, and the operating room dismantled itself around the Force release that came out of him. Equipment crushed, everything in reach bending and breaking. A sound from inside the suit that was grief articulated as pure mechanical force. He stood, and the respirator filled the silence with the sound that would define him for the next 2 decades. That slow, rhythmic, contained breath, in and out, the only evidence that whatever was inside the armor was still alive. Anakin Skywalker was 22 years old. Darth Vader was less than a day old. And from that moment forward, for most of the people who would ever know his name. The second was all they would ever know. The Empire announced itself to the galaxy with the particular confidence of a thing that has spent a long time being built in secret and is finally complete. Palpatine, the Emperor now, Supreme Chancellor transformed by emergency vote into something permanent and absolute, framed the Jedi as traitors who had attempted to seize power and been stopped. The clone army became the Stormtrooper Corps. The Senate continued in a reduced and decorative capacity that everyone understood was temporary. The Republic's institutions dissolved, not in fire, but in procedure, in the specific nightmare of democracy committing suicide through its own mechanisms. And the galaxy watched it happen, and most of it, exhausted from the war, accepted. Vader accepted nothing. This is not the right word. He did not have the capacity for acceptance or rejection in those first months. He had compliance, which is different. He followed orders because following orders was what he could manage, and managing anything was more than the situation deserved. He hunted Jedi because that was what Palpatine gave him to do. And hunting was something his hands knew how to accomplish, even when the rest of him was barely functional. He was a weapon loaded and pointed at a specific target, and the weapon fired, and the Jedi died. There were surviving Jedi in those first months, scattered, in hiding, most of them too frightened, and too few to be effective. And Vader found them one by one, with a methodical patience that was, in its own way, the most terrible thing about him. They sent the Inquisitors first, former Jedi turned dark side hunters, and when the Inquisitors were not sufficient, they sent Vader. He did not take satisfaction in these missions. That would have required a kind of engagement with his own existence that he had not yet developed. He completed them. He returned. He received the next one. The suit was its own dimension of suffering that existed independently of the grief and the guilt and the purposelessness. It was a prison that kept him alive, which is the most precisely designed punishment imaginable to be maintained in a state that is not living, to be kept functional enough to serve, to be dependent on the machinery for every breath. The suit's designers had been Sith, and the Sith understand pain in ways that go beyond the merely physical. The design was not efficient. It was not the best technology available. It was built to hurt. Each breath requiring effort the machinery provided, but the nervous system registered as insufficient. Each movement processed through interfaces that allowed function but denied comfort. Each moment inside it a reminder that this was what he had traded, the life he had for. He was not, during these years, fully Vader or fully Anakin. He was something in between the architecture of one identity, built over the rubble of another, neither complete. When Anakin broke through the surface, which happened in involuntary flickers he could not prevent, the suit contained the response. The respirator continued its rhythm. The mask showed nothing. The grief was internal and private and immense, and it fueled the dark side that sustained him the way fuel sustains a fire that is consuming the building that contains it. He went to Naboo once, in those early years, and stood at Padmé's tomb. He stood there for a long time. The marble was cool and her face was carved into the stone with an accuracy that suggested someone who had loved her had been given authority over the design. And he placed one gauntleted hand against the stone, and the material was cold, and she was inside it, and he was outside it, and the distance between them was absolute. He did not speak. The respirator breathed for him. He left. The years accumulated. The Empire consolidated. The Rebel Alliance formed from the scattered remnants of Republic loyalty and Jedi-adjacent networks, and simple human refusal to accept what the galaxy had become. Vader hunted them too. This was more like work. The rebels were capable fighters, sometimes brilliant ones, and the tactical puzzle of their campaigns was at least something his mind could engage with. He was still, beneath everything, an extraordinary military intelligence. The dark side had not taken that. It had sharpened it, in the way that cold sharpens edges. He had a son. He did not know this yet. Padme had lived long enough for the twins to be born Luke and Leia, delivered on Polis Massa before she died, carried to safety by Bail Organa and Obi-Wan, who had been present. Obi-Wan took Luke to Tatooine, to the Lars homestead, to Owen and Beru, who were family and who would raise him in the desert under the same twin suns that had shaped Anakin. Bail Organa took Leia to Alderaan and raised her as his daughter. The children were hidden. The Force was patient. And then, in the year the Empire designated 0BBY, a small rebel ship was captured above the desert planet of Tatooine with stolen Death Star plans aboard, and a pilot climbed out of a damaged X-wing above the Imperial battle station and shot a precise 2-meter-wide shot down a thermal exhaust port, and the Death Star exploded, and Vader watched it happen from a TIE fighter and survived, and set himself the task of discovering who the pilot was. The name came back through intelligence channels shortly afterward. Luke Skywalker, from Tatooine. Think about what that moment was. 19 years of nothing, of a grief, so absolute it had become the floor of his existence, the baseline below which everything else measured itself, and then a name. 2 words. A name he recognized as the shape of a person he had been before the suit, before the Emperor, before Mustafa. The name his son would have had if his son had been born and survived and been given a name. His son, alive, on Tatooine, flying for the rebellion. He did not tell the Emperor immediately. This is important. He found out his son was alive, and he held it privately for a moment that stretched into days. And during those days, something shifted in the architecture of Darth Vader in a way that was small enough to be invisible from the outside and enormous from the inside. He had had nothing. For 19 years, the thing that had defined Anakin Skywalker, the need to protect the people he loved, the capacity for love itself as a motivating force, had been running in a void with no object to attach to, burning inward instead of outward. And now, there was a name, a direction, a reason. He wanted to find Luke. He was not certain, even to himself, what he would do when he found him. The dark side told him to use the boy as leverage, to bring him before the Emperor, to turn him as he himself had been turned. Something older and more persistent than the dark side told him something different. He did not listen to that thing yet, but he heard it. He set the machinery of the Empire to finding Luke Skywalker, probe droids fanning out across the galaxy, until one of them located the hidden rebel base on the ice planet Hoth, and the Imperial fleet descended, and the rebels fled. And Luke escaped again, and always. And Vader made a decision. He was going to find the boy himself, not through the Emperor's apparatus, himself. He used bounty hunters to track the Millennium Falcon. The trail led to Cloud City, a mining colony in the atmosphere of the gas giant Bespin, run by an old friend of the rebel pilot named Han Solo. Vader arrived before Solo's ship and waited. With the patience he had learned in 19 years of having nothing else to be, he set his trap. He hurt Solo and froze him in carbonite and put him in the hands of a bounty hunter. He did all of this because the boy would come for his friends, because he was his father's son, in that one specific and crucial way. And the boy's love for his friends would bring him. Luke came. The duel in the carbon freezing chamber and the reactor shaft was unlike any fight Vader had been in since Mustafar. Because this one, he was not trying to win. He was trying to recruit. He was testing the boy's abilities extraordinary, raw, undertrained, remarkable, and finding the approach that might work. He hurt Luke. He pushed him through the fight methodically, stripping away the boy's ability to rely on aggression, forcing him back to the edge of a shaft that dropped into the reactor. And then Luke fell rather than retreat and caught himself on a gantry below and held on. Vader descended to him, and he told him the truth. He told Luke Skywalker that he was his father. He said, "I am your father." Not Obi-Wan's version of events, not the comfortable lie that Anakin Skywalker was dead, destroyed, replaced by a monster, but the actual truth. The truth that had been hidden for 19 years in service of a story about the past that other people had needed, and that had cost this boy his real history. He told him the truth, and then he told him that together they could destroy the Emperor and rule the galaxy as father and son, could end the war, could remake what had been made wrong. Luke refused. He let go of the gantry and fell into the shaft, which was either courage or despair, or a combination that only the Force, at that moment, could have distinguished between. And Vader watched him fall and felt something he had not felt in 19 years. The specific pain of someone who wants a thing that matters and has not yet found the way to have it. Luke survived. He always survived. The Force, which had been arranging this story for decades, was not going to let it end on a reactor shaft. And Vader, Darth Vader, Lord of the Sith, the Emperor's enforcer, the darkness that had been the galaxy's defining terror for 19 years, stood on that gantry and said, through the bond they shared, through the living tissue of the Force that connected them, "You do not know the power of the dark side. I must obey my master." He said it, and even as he said it, something in him knew it was not entirely true anymore. The next year brought the Emperor's plan to its conclusion. Luke had surrendered himself to Imperial forces on Endor, unwilling to lead Vader to the rebel strike team hidden on the forest moon. He was brought to the Emperor's throne room on the second Death Star, where Palpatine had arranged what he intended to be the last act of a long drama. Luke would fight Vader, kill him if he could, and take his place as Palpatine's new apprentice, younger, stronger, the next link in the chain of the rule of two. Palpatine was not being subtle about this. He told Luke everything. He wanted the boy to feel the weight of inevitability, wanted the anger and the fear to be sufficient to tip him over the edge. Luke would not fight. He had come here to save his father, not to fight him. And he told Vader that directly told him that there was still good in him, told him that he could feel it, told him that he was not going to be the instrument of his father's destruction. Vader told him that it was too late for that. He meant it, or meant it as fully as someone can mean a thing when something inside them is listening to the other side of it. The Emperor tortured Luke with Force lightning. He made it theatrical and prolonged and aimed it not just at Luke's body but at Vader. "Look at this," he was saying. "Look at your son suffering while you stand here. Look at what your loyalty to me has purchased." Luke cried out. He said, "Father, please." Vader lifted Palpatine. He picked him up, the Emperor who had owned him for 23 years. The man who had shaped him into the thing he had been, who had engineered his fall and used his grief, and built the suit that kept him breathing. And he walked to the shaft at the center of the reactor core, and he threw him in. The Emperor's lightning, still firing, struck Vader's suit as he held him. The life support systems already compromised, already working at less than capacity, took damage that could not be repaired. He could feel it happening in a remote and informational way, the suit telling him what he already knew. The systems were failing. He had a finite amount of time left. Luke pulled him back from the edge of the shaft. His son pulled him back and tried to carry him, this big and heavy and broken machine that Anakin Skywalker lived inside, dragging him toward the shuttle bay, through the sounds of a space station beginning its collapse. And Vader told him to go. Luke said he would not leave him. Vader told him to leave, told him there was no time. Luke said he had to save him. And Vader Anakin, in this moment, more fully Anakin than he had been since he knelt in that office, and said the words told him, "You already have." He asked Luke to take off his mask. Luke said it would kill him. He told him he wanted, just once, to look at his son with his own eyes. Luke removed the mask. Beneath it was a face that had been destroyed and reconstructed and destroyed again, in ways that left it barely recognizable as the face that had smiled at Shmi on Tatooine and kissed Padme in the garden on Naboo and laughed with Rex in the field. But it was still a face. It was still eyes. And with those eyes, for the first and only time, Anakin Skywalker looked at his son. He told Luke to tell his sister that he was right about him, that there had been good in him after all. And then he released the suit, the breathing, the weight of 2 decades, the whole enormous structure of it, and he was gone. Luke carried the armor off the Death Star in the seconds before it was destroyed. He brought it to the forest moon of Endor, where the rebels and the Ewoks were celebrating the end of something that had lasted a generation. And he built a pyre at the edge of the village, and he burned the armor, and the black smoke rose into the night sky above Endor while the celebration went on below. And Luke stood at the fire alone and said goodbye to a man the galaxy would spend decades trying to categorize. The armor burned. What remained was the distorted remnant of Darth Vader's helmet, collapsed and empty in the ash. And in a grove of trees a short distance from the pyre, Luke saw 3 figures, luminous and still. Obi-Wan, who had guided him, Yoda, who had trained him, and someone he recognized from no living memory, someone younger than he expected, someone who looked at him with an expression of such complete peace that Luke understood, without any explanation, who he was. Anakin Skywalker returned to himself, finally, actually himself. The weight gone, the suit gone, the years of darkness folded back, and the person underneath the boy who had wanted to be free, who had built a droid to keep his mother company, who had raced a pod across a desert and wept when he had to leave, who had loved too fiercely for any institution to contain, finally, simply present. He watched his son. He smiled. And then the living moved back toward the celebration, and the dead remained in the light they had earned. And the night on Endor was warm, and the galaxy had room to breathe again. What does it mean? The full sweep of his life, from the slave quarters of Mos Espa to the luminous presence in that grove. What does it mean? People have been arguing about this since the night the Empire fell, and they will continue arguing because the story is large enough to hold multiple answers simultaneously without any of them being wrong. It means something that the Chosen One was not a warrior priest of the Jedi Order's imagination. He was a boy they almost refused to train, a person they never fully accepted, whose gifts they celebrated, and whose needs they failed. The prophecy was fulfilled not in spite of his attachment and his love, but through it, because the thing that drove him to the dark side was the same thing that pulled him back. And the Jedi who told him that attachment was a path to ruin were not wrong about the first part, but missed the second. Love can destroy, and love can redeem. These are not contradictions. They are the same river moving in different seasons. It means something that the man who killed younglings in the Jedi Temple is the same man who threw the Emperor down the shaft of the Death Star. This is not comfortable. It was never supposed to be comfortable. The story of Anakin Skywalker is not a story about the line between good and evil being clear. It is a story about what happens when a person crosses that line, and whether crossing it means they can never come back. The answer the story gives is, they can. Not without cost, not without the long wait of everything they did, but they can. Luke understood this. The Force understood this. Whether the rest of the galaxy ever will is an ongoing question. It means something that Shmi Skywalker's son, born into slavery on the most forgotten planet in the galaxy, became the axis on which everything turned. Not because he was perfect, not because he got it right, because he was, in the deepest layer of himself, beneath the Jedi and the Sith and the armor and the grief, a person who loved, who wanted to protect the people he loved, who would go to any length in service of that impulse, including the wrong lengths, including the lengths that destroyed him, and who, in the last moment available to him, remembered what that love had always been for. The Force ghost of Anakin Skywalker stood in a grove on Endor and watched his son walk toward a celebration that would not have been possible without everything Anakin had done and everything he had failed to do. And the peace he felt was not the peace of someone who has been forgiven by an external authority. It was the peace of someone who has completed a thing, who has walked every step of a road that could only be walked in that specific way at that specific cost, and has arrived at the place where the road ends. He had been a slave and a Jedi and a husband and a general and a Sith Lord and a father and a dead man and a ghost. He had been the hero with no fear and the monster in the suit and the man under the mask. He had been the instrument of the galaxy's darkest hour and the hand that ended it. He had been Anakin and Vader and, in the end, Anakin again. He had been the chosen one. He had been the one who brought balance. Not by being good, by being real, by carrying everything the Force had loaded into one life and arriving, at last, at the other side of it. The twin suns of Tatooine rose the morning after the Emperor died, on a world that did not yet know it was free, over a slave quarter that was slightly less full of despair than it had been the day before, over a patch of desert where the Lars homestead still stood, over a grave where Shmi Skywalker rested. The suns rose and the light swept across the sand in the particular way that Tatooine light always moves fast and total and without mercy, and somewhere beyond the atmosphere, in the light of a different star, a pyre had burned the night before, and a son had said goodbye to his father. And the Force, which had been patient for a very long time, breathed.